We have news from Trump land. The judge overseeing the federal election interference case involving the former president issued a gag order forbidding Donald Trump from making statements about potential witnesses or disparaging comments regarding prosecutors. United States District Judge Tanya Chutkan said she would not impose restrictions on Trump's statements about Washington, D.C. and its residents, God help us, or statements criticizing the government or Justice Department in general, but did impose a restriction that banned all parties from making or reposting any statements targeting the special counsel. Now, Judge Chutkan said in a statement, Mr. Trump may still vigorously seek public support as a presidential candidate, debate policies and people related to that candidacy, criticize the current administration, and assert his belief that this prosecution is politically motivated, but those critical First Amendment freedoms do not allow him to launch a pretrial smear campaign against participating government staff, their families, and foreseeable witnesses.
The Don told a crowd in Adel, Iowa yesterday that he intends to appeal the judge's ruling imposing the gag order.
Today, a judge put on a gag order. I'll be the only politician in history that runs with a gag order where I'm not allowed to criticize people. Can you imagine this? Do you believe this? I'm not allowed to criticize people. So we'll see. We'll appeal it, and we'll see. But it's so unconstitutional. The good thing is we have so much support, it's incredible. And it just makes it even more so. Look, I'm the only guy that ever got indicted. I got indicted more than Alphonse Capone. I'm not supposed to be talking about things that bad people do. And so we'll be appealing very quickly.
So it's his right to appeal, obviously, and, work this out through the legal process. Gag orders are, I think, often, unfortunately, a accepted part of the legal process. They're issued to people. So, he can argue, he can take, whatever efforts to argue that this one is overly broad. I don't know how those arguments will fare, given that gag orders are something that are imposed on people in trials like this.
And that it's pretty narrow. It's actually narrowly drawn. She didn't even preclude him from talking about the judge. It's mostly him targeting the staff members who are just in the courtroom doing their jobs. He went after the court clerk, accusing her of being in a relationship with, I can't remember who it was now, Chuck Schumer, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the kind of thing that they're trying to preclude him from doing. You can talk about corruption. You can talk about D.C. You can talk about how you think you're being unfairly prosecuted. You can talk about the swamp. You can talk about basically anything other than targeting the individual human beings that are working in the courtroom and intimidating them.
But so the part of it that I think is an issue and will substantially hamper Trump's ability to make arguments publicly that he thinks he has to make, regardless, set aside whether it is legal, and unless he can appeal it and have determined it's not legal. It's gag order. The existence of a gag order is clearly consistent with the First Amendment because the Supreme Court has not by now said you can't do this kind of thing. It will, however, I think, with the Mike Pence aspect in particular, there was some line drawing with, well, you can still argue against Mike Pence from a candidate standpoint, but that Trump has to be very careful when he talks about Mike Pence with respect to the January 6th plan, that I think is going to be kind of difficult, is going to be open to abusive interpretation. I think this will hamstring Donald Trump's, what he wants to do, the case he wants to make for why this is a witch hunt and everything. Now, again, I'm not saying it's actually unconstitutional.
Well, how will it hamper his case? Because of course, the gag order doesn't mean he can't, and his advocates can't make in the context of the courtroom whatever arguments he wants to make about Mike Pence. The question is, does he have an unlimited right in the public sphere outside of the courtroom to make accusations, whether they potentially untrue accusations about Mike Pence that aren't about his conduct, but which are geared toward getting people to want to hurt him. That's the issue here, is witness intimidation. Are you trying to get someone to change their testimony because they're afraid for their life? And while in other instances you might be able to say that's a hyperbolic fear, when you had, I'm sorry, on 1/6, people who are big supporters of Trump erecting a guillotine outside of the Capitol and chanting,
but Mike Pence is not.
Wait a minute. And chanting, hang Mike Pence, I do think you have to have some special consideration of whether or not he's endangering people's lives by signaling them out, not to make arguments about their guilt or innocence here or the veracity of their testimony, but personal attacks.
Mike Pence is not just a witness at this trial. He's a rival of Donald Trump's for the presidential nomination.
Yeah.
And to have any limits on how Trump can go after people who are contesting him for the nomination, I see how Trump himself and his supporters and a lot of Republicans will find that deeply unfair and deeply limiting. Again, I'm not arguing it's illegal or unconstitutional, that there's anything he can do about it. But I see the frustration they're going to have,
Sure.
and I think it's not a good norm in a democracy for you to be, we're all about free speech, right? We're not, again, and I'm not arguing it's violating any actual law here, but for the climate of free speech, for him to not, he's not participating in the debates anyway, but if he was, that he'd have to pull his punches with respect to Mike Pence because there's this gag order involving this trial, is, I think, very concerning.
Mike Pence is polling, in the single digits? What's concerning, the balance that now has to be made, the balance that has to be struck because Donald Trump allegedly engaged in a number of credible criminal activities is between his ability to run a campaign without any restrictions and the criminal justice system being able to pursue credible allegations that he conspired to rig an election, that he refused to return confidential documents after repeated requests, that he, was fraudulent on these various real estate forms and tax forms, et cetera, in New York. That's a position, that no one put Trump in except for himself. And it does feel like a real abdication of personal responsibility to say, oh no, Donald Trump is being gag ordered in this way. No one else, this is an unprecedented situation. Yeah, it is an unprecedented situation because no other presidential candidate has gotten themselves this deep in it through their own behavior over the years. And these are the trade-offs that are gonna have to be made. I'm sorry. It's like how we talk about the document case, it is the silliest of all the cases. But if you have a clear and flagrant violation of the law, then what do you expect people to do? Just not pursue your flagrant violation of the law?
Let me ask you this. You have a law degree, so you have more experience here than I do. Are there cases, I presume there are, but you know more than I do, are there cases where gag orders have been too broad and have been limiting of, forget Trump, but of deserving plaintiffs or defendants or people being railroaded who've been effectively hampered in arguing their case by an overbroad gag order? Maybe,
I can't speak
motivated by a prosecution that...
We're talking about, talking about your out-of-court statements, which can never stand for the truth of those statements inside of the courtroom. Donald Trump and everybody else has to make, prosecutors have to make their case in the courtroom about what they want to argue. What Donald Trump is trying to do, which many people try to do, I'm not saying he's unique in this regard, is trying to affect public opinion outside of the courtroom in a way that can potentially alter what happens in the courtroom by threatening witnesses, intimidating witnesses, which is illegal, and by affecting the jury pool, because you can't find a clean jury pool and they might be sympathetic to Donald Trump or against Donald Trump. It's going to be difficult for anybody to really do these jury selections in the cases where there are juries because he's such a famous person and he's talking so much. But the difference between what you're trying to do outside and inside are two very different things. He's not being gagged in any way. If those are the rules saying Donald Trump can't make X, Y, and Z argument because I don't like him or whatever, because, to even make the case in his own defense is intimidating to a witness, that's a very different thing than saying that outside the courtroom, he can't make, what I want to be really clear, are also fraudulent statements about the personal sexual activity of a court clerk. I can't think of, frankly, a more limited gag order in the world than please don't cast aspersions.
It says specifically that he may not criticize Mike Pence about the events in the case. Let's say they were on a debate stage together, and Mike Pence starts going off on Donald Trump about his role in January 6th. Donald Trump just kind of has to say no comment?
Well, no, he can say what he wants to say and then get fined or whatever.
Well, okay.
But look,
okay.
I don't disagree that that's limiting, but how concerned should I be about that? When you're balancing the scales of witness intimidation, which is illegal, and his ability to do a debate. Donald Trump put himself in the situation, and the court has to create a balance. Now, there are ways to respond. I think Donald Trump is very good with words, and I'm sure he can figure out how to respond. He can choose to ignore the gag order and simply get fined. There's some chance that he might be thrown in jail, but there's been a lot of discussion about how that is unprecedented, and part of why Donald Trump has repeatedly ignored warnings up until this gag order is because he knows at the end of the day, nobody wants to be in a position of throwing a former president in jail. Like, nobody wants to do that. And so he can basically act with impunity. And 3, when you're doing balancing tests, this is something from law school that is useful that I can speak to. When you're doing balancing tests, you have to weigh the actual harm that is likely to accrue. And if this were someone who was polling anywhere close to Donald Trump, or even in a Ron DeSantis land, I might have a beat of more concern and say, well, maybe the balancing test militates toward giving Trump more deference because he has to defend himself on the debate stage against a really credible opponent. In this case, between all of these factors, including Mike Pence barely being on...
Then the judge is having to decide how credible the challenge to Donald Trump for the nomination is.
I'm sorry.
Briahna.
Robby, Donald Trump shouldn't do crimes. I don't know what to tell you. If Donald Trump weren't in this position, and if he hadn't, if Donald Trump hadn't spent the last weeks and months flagrantly ignoring warnings from the court that he cannot target people in the courtroom and behave this way, then he would never be in this situation. I'm sorry. What is the alternative, Robby? That Donald Trump should be allowed to say whatever he wants about anybody regardless of the implications for witness tampering or undermining the justice system's ability to pursue this case?
No, I didn't say that, but we're disagreeing on how limited this gag order truly is. And I think given that Mike Pence is a political rival for the nomination, I think the trust in the democratic process should take some the need to have a democratic process should take some precedence. So you agree with the other parts
of the gag order, just not the Mike Pence part?
Wants to say he can't threaten the judge and the prosecutor's family. I mean, of course not. But
okay, I mean, I do think the Mike Pence part is the most dubious, but not just because of the electoral consequences, but because Mike Pence is not a random low-income court clerk who can't defend himself. Mike Pence is someone who can have security and isn't quite as vulnerable, I think, as when Donald Trump targets members of the general public the way he did those 2 poll workers down in Georgia who won their case against him for lying about them having stuffed ballot boxes and done an election fraud. So I'm much more concerned about those kinds of instances than a multimillionaire former vice president and presidential candidate like Mike Pence. Just, again, weighing the potential costs, I don't think there's anything that's likely bad that's going to happen to him. To the extent that there's people coming for his head because Donald Trump hasn't told them to lay off. To the extent that those hang Mike Pence people are still out there, they're out there already. And he should be aware of that and protect himself, and I'm sure that he already is. That's the least of my concerns.
Well, you tell us what you think about this, and we'll have more Rising right after this.